Jake Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his old Ford truck rumbled down the quiet streets of Willow Creek, Texas. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the road, illuminating the dust swirling in the crisp autumn air. Beside him, his 7-year-old daughter Lily sat motionless, staring blankly out the window as the scenery passed by. She didn't hum along to the radio. She didn't tap her fingers against the seat. She didn't even glance at her father. She never did. Jake sighed, his heart heavy with the familiar ache of helplessness. It had been 3 years since his wife Sarah had passed away. 3 years since Lily had stopped speaking. She hadn't uttered a single word since that terrible night. The doctors called it selective mutism, a psychological response to extreme trauma. Therapists had tried to reach her. Specialists had encouraged different techniques. But nothing had worked. And Jake, once a fearless Marine who had faced life and death situations on the battlefield, found himself utterly powerless in the face of his daughter's silence. As they approached the school, Jake pulled into the drop-off lane and put the truck in park. He turned to Lily, offering her a small smile. "All right, kiddo. You ready?" he asked, knowing he wouldn't get an answer. Lily didn't move. Her big, blue eyes, so much like her mother's, remained fixed on something distant, something unreachable. Jake's smile faltered, but he forced himself to stay upbeat. "Miss Brown said today's art project is about animals. You love animals, don't you?" Still nothing. With a sigh, he reached over and unbuckled her seatbelt. The second the latch clicked free, Lily opened the door and slid out, her small backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder. She didn't look back as she walked toward the school entrance, her steps quiet, almost ghost-like. Jake watched her go, his gut twisting. "Damn it, Sarah," he muttered under his breath. "I don't know how to do this without you." Jake wasn't always this lost. Once, he had been Sergeant Jake Carter of the United States Marine Corps. 10 years of service. Multiple deployments. Leadership, discipline, confidence, he had them all. But war changed people. And when he finally left the battlefield, he thought the hardest part of his life was behind him. He was wrong. Losing Sarah had shattered him. It had broken Lily. And no matter how hard he tried to rebuild, he felt like he was failing. His job as a night shift security officer at a shopping center paid the bills, but it wasn't fulfilling. His home, once filled with laughter and warmth, was now a place of quiet echoes. And his daughter, the only piece of Sarah he had left, was slipping further away with each passing day. Something had to change. And that something came in the most unexpected form. Later that afternoon, Jake sat across from Miss Brown, Lily's teacher, in a small classroom filled with colorful posters and neatly stacked books. The woman, a kind-hearted woman in her 50s, folded her hands together and looked at him with gentle concern. "Mr. Carter, I know how much you've been struggling to connect with Lily," she said softly. Jake exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've tried everything, Miss Brown. Therapists, specialists, new routines, nothing's working." Miss Brown hesitated for a moment before leaning forward. "Have you considered getting Lily a therapy dog?" Jake blinked. "A dog?" "Yes. Studies show that children with selective mutism or autism often respond better to animals than to people. A therapy dog might help Lily feel safe enough to open up, even if it's just small steps." Jake frowned, skepticism creeping in. "I was a Marine, Miss Brown. I've seen men come back from war with service dogs. I know they work for PTSD. But for a kid who won't talk?" Miss Brown smiled gently. "Sometimes the right companion can reach places in a child's heart that even a parent can't." The words stung. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right. Jake sighed. He wasn't sure about this. But at this point, what did he have to lose? The next morning, Jake drove to the Willow Creek Animal Rescue Shelter. The place smelled of disinfectant and damp fur, and the sounds of barking dogs echoed through the narrow corridors. A young volunteer named Emily greeted him with a warm smile. "Looking to adopt?" Jake hesitated. I think so. I need a dog for my daughter. A calm one. Nothing too hyper." Emily nodded, leading him toward the kennels. "We have a few great candidates. Let me show you around." As they walked past the cages, dozens of dogs barked and wagged their tails, eager for attention. But one dog, sitting silently in the farthest corner, caught Jake's eye. A black German Shepherd mix, lean but strong, with piercing amber eyes that seemed to hold a story of their own. Emily noticed his gaze and nodded. "That's Shadow. He was found abandoned on the outskirts of town. He doesn't bark much, keeps to himself, but he's incredibly intelligent." Jake crouched down, meeting the dog's eyes. Shadow didn't move, didn't whimper. He simply stared back, unblinking, assessing Jake just as Jake was assessing him. There was something about this dog. Something familiar. A soldier's gaze in a canine's body. Jake's gut told him what his mind hadn't yet processed. This was the one. Shadow didn't move as Jake studied him. The German Shepherd mix sat perfectly still, his amber eyes locked onto Jake's like a soldier awaiting orders. Jake had seen that look before. Not on dogs, on men. On fellow Marines who had been through hell and back, carrying the weight of battles both external and internal. "This one," Jake said, his voice firm. Emily, the young volunteer, blinked in surprise. "You sure?" "Shadow's a bit different. He doesn't interact much, doesn't bark or jump like the others. Some people think he's too distant." Jake smirked slightly. "Sounds familiar." Emily nodded and led Shadow out of the kennel. The dog moved with measured grace, keeping his head low but eyes constantly scanning. No sudden movements, no unnecessary energy, just quiet, controlled awareness. A soldier's instinct. Jake knelt and extended his hand, palm up. Shadow sniffed it once, then sat back, as if acknowledging Jake's presence, but not demanding attention. Yeah, this was the one. The drive back home was silent. Jake kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching Shadow. The dog sat in the back seat, perfectly still, gazing out the window as if processing his new surroundings. No whining, no shifting, just silent observation. Lily was the same way. When they pulled into the driveway, Jake took a deep breath. This was the real test. He opened Lily's door first. She climbed out wordlessly, her backpack still slung over one shoulder. Then he opened the back door, allowing Shadow to step out. For a brief moment, man, child, and dog stood in an unspoken triangle. Lily's blue eyes flickered toward Shadow, just for a second, before shifting away. Shadow didn't react. He simply sat down, his gaze unwavering but calm. He wasn't seeking attention, just existing in the same space. Jake watched closely. Would Lily acknowledge him? Would she reach out? Show any sign of curiosity? Nothing. She turned and walked inside. Jake sighed. So much for that. That evening, Jake set up a corner for Shadow in the living room with a soft blanket and a water bowl. The dog settled down immediately, as if accepting his new home without question. But as the hours passed, Jake found himself growing uneasy. Was this a mistake? Had he just brought another responsibility into a life already weighed down by stress? Lily had barely even glanced at Shadow. Maybe Miss Brown had been wrong. Maybe no amount of therapy dogs could fix what was broken inside his daughter. With a sigh, Jake ran a hand through his short-cropped hair and turned off the living room lights. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "Let's see what happens tomorrow." Shadow didn't move from his spot. He simply watched as Jake retreated to his room, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light. Then, as the house fell into silence, He slowly stood up and padded toward Lily's door. In the middle of the night, something stirred Jake from his restless sleep. A sound. Faint, but distinct. A whimper. He sat up instantly, his marine instincts kicking in. Lily. Throwing off the covers, he hurried down the hall. As he reached Lily's room, he saw something that made him freeze. Shadow was already there. The dog sat quietly beside Lily's bed, his ears pricked forward, watching her with careful intensity. Lily's small hands gripped her blanket tightly. Her breathing was uneven, her face scrunched up in distress. She was having a nightmare. And Shadow knew. Before Jake could move, Shadow did something incredible. He leaned forward and gently licked Lily's hand. Jake held his breath. Lily stirred slightly. Her fingers twitched. Then, slowly her hand relaxed. Her breathing evened out. The tension in her face eased. And just like that, the nightmare passed. Jake exhaled, staring at Shadow with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next morning, Jake poured himself a cup of coffee, glancing toward the living room where Shadow lay curled up near the couch. Lily sat at the kitchen table, her small hands resting on her lap, her gaze distant as usual. Jake hesitated, then made a decision. "Lily," he said gently, placing a bowl of cereal in front of her. "Did you sleep okay?" No response. Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "Why do I even try?" Then movement. Not from Lily, from Shadow. The dog lifted his head, ears perking up slightly at the sound of Jake's voice. But instead of looking at Jake, he looked directly at Lily. And for the first time ever, Lily did something unexpected. She looked back. It was brief, just a flicker of a glance. But Jake saw it. Shadow saw it. And in that moment, something changed. Jake Carter was a patient man, at least, he used to be. The Marine Corps had drilled discipline into his bones, taught him how to wait, how to control his emotions, how to think ahead. But parenting? Parenting was an entirely different battlefield. It had been 3 days since Shadow arrived, and while Jake had noticed a few small changes, he wasn't sure if they were real progress or just wishful thinking. Lily still didn't talk. She still avoided eye contact. She still lived in her own little world. But something was different. Shadow was always near her. Not in an intrusive way, not like a clingy pet begging for attention. Instead, the dog positioned himself just close enough to be present, near enough for Lily to reach if she wanted, but never forcing her to interact. And to Jake's astonishment, Lily allowed it. She didn't push Shadow away. She didn't move to a different room when he settled nearby. It was a subtle shift, but Jake saw it. And it gave him hope. It was a quiet evening. The house was filled with the soft hum of the television, though no one was really watching. Jake sat on the couch, flipping through the bills he had yet to pay. Shadow was curled up on the floor. Lily sat cross-legged a few feet away, stacking her favorite set of wooden blocks. She did this often, building precise, symmetrical towers, only to knock them down and start over. Jake glanced at her, then at Shadow. The dog had been watching her for the past 10 minutes, his head slightly tilted in curiosity. Then, Shadow moved. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his paw, and without knocking anything over nudged one of the blocks toward Lily. Jake froze. Lily did too. Her small hands hovered over the tower, her entire body going still. Jake held his breath. Would she push Shadow away? Would she get up and leave? Instead, Lily did something completely unexpected. She picked up the block Shadow had nudged and placed it back on the tower. She accepted his gesture. Jake's heart pounded. He didn't dare speak, didn't dare move, afraid he might shatter the delicate moment unfolding before him. Shadow wagged his tail just once, then settled down again, as if the interaction had meant nothing. But to Jake, it meant everything. Later that night, as Jake lay in bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Was he reading too much into this? Was this really progress, or was he just desperate for something, anything, to prove he wasn't failing as a father? His thoughts churned, doubts pressing against the fragile hope he had begun to build. Then, a sound broke through the silence. Soft footsteps. Jake sat up immediately. Lily never got up at night, not unless something was wrong. He hurried out of bed, moving down the hallway toward her room. But when he reached the doorway, he stopped. Lily wasn't in her bed. She was sitting on the floor. And Shadow was there, lying beside her, his head resting in her lap. Jake's throat tightened. Lily's fingers, small, hesitant, were tangled in Shadow's black fur. She wasn't hugging him. She wasn't petting him like a normal child would. But she was touching him. It was the first time she had voluntarily reached out to another living being since Sarah died. Jake swallowed hard, emotion tightening his chest. He stepped away, letting the moment remain undisturbed. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, this was working. The next morning, as Jake dropped Lily off at school, Miss Brown greeted him with a curious look. "She seems calmer today," the teacher noted, glancing at Lily as she walked toward the classroom. "Did something happen?" Jake hesitated, then nodded. "I think she's warming up to the dog." Miss Brown smiled. "That's wonderful." Jake wasn't so sure yet. Because despite the progress, despite the small moments that gave him hope, something still felt off. Lily's connection with Shadow was growing, but she still wasn't responding to him. Not in words, not in gestures. And that terrified him. Because if she could bond with a dog, but not her own father, what did that say about him? The sound of laughter drifted through the open windows of Willow Creek Elementary School. Jake stood by the pickup lane, arms crossed, watching the other kids run across the playground, their voices bright and full of life. Lily wasn't among them. She never was. She sat alone, as usual, on the wooden bench near the fence, her small fingers tracing patterns on her backpack. But this time, something was different. Her gaze wasn't lost in the distance. She was looking at Shadow. The black German shepherd sat obediently beside her, tail resting on the ground, his amber eyes focused solely on her. They weren't playing. They weren't talking. But they were connected. And for the first time in years, Lily wasn't truly alone. Jake clenched his jaw. He should have been happy. He should have been relieved. So why did he feel like he was being left behind? That night, Jake sat on the couch, staring at the muted television screen, a beer resting untouched in his hand. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, lining up her blocks in a perfect row. Shadow lay beside her, his head resting on his paws, watching her every move. Jake took a deep breath. "Try again. Keep trying." "Lily," he said, keeping his voice calm, careful. "What do you want for dinner?" "Mac and cheese?" No answer. Jake's grip tightened around the beer bottle. "How about pizza?" He tried again. "We haven't had pizza in a while." Lily didn't even look at him. But the moment Shadow shifted, her eyes flickered toward the dog. And that was it. That was the moment Jake snapped. "Unbelievable," he muttered, pushing himself off the couch. Lily didn't react, but Shadow did. The dog lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching at Jake's tone. Jake turned away, running a hand through his hair, his chest tight with frustration. "I'm her father," he muttered under his breath. "Not you." The words were barely above a whisper, but they still hung heavy in the air. Shadow didn't move. He just watched. And somehow, that made it worse. That night, the rain came down in sheets, slamming against the windows, the wind howling through the trees. Jake tossed and turned, restless. He wasn't sure if it was the storm keeping him up, or the lingering bitterness in his chest. Then a sharp, frantic bark cut through the darkness. Jake was on his feet instantly, heart pounding. He sprinted down the hall, his instincts screaming Lily. As he reached her room, he nearly collided with Shadow, who was already standing in front of the door, his body tense, his tail stiff. "Lily?" Jake threw open the door. The room was pitch black, except for the faint, flickering glow of the nightlight. Lily sat in bed, her small frame shaking violently, her hands clutching the sheets. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. A panic attack. Jake cursed under his breath and moved toward her. Hey baby, I'm here." "It's okay." Lily didn't react, but Shadow did. Before Jake could reach her, Shadow jumped onto the bed, not aggressively, but with purpose. Jake opened his mouth to stop him, but then he saw it. Shadow pressed his body gently against Lily's side, his warmth grounding her, his slow, rhythmic breathing forcing her own to sync with his. Her fingers, which had been trembling uncontrollably, curled into his fur, and little by little her breathing slowed. Jake froze. His daughter wasn't responding to him. She was responding to the dog. Shadow had done in seconds what Jake couldn't do in 3 years. The truth hit him like a bullet. Maybe he wasn't enough for her. Jake sat on the edge of the couch long after Lily had fallen back asleep. Shadow lay at his feet, quiet, ever watchful. "I don't get it," Jake whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "I'm her dad. I've been here every damn day. I've tried everything." Shadow didn't react. "She doesn't talk to me," Jake continued, his voice cracking slightly. "She doesn't even see me. But you? One look and she calms down." The words felt bitter on his tongue. He wanted to hate the dog. He wanted to resent how easily Shadow had done what he couldn't. But deep down, beneath the frustration, beneath the jealousy, there was something else. Something terrifying. Relief. Because, at the end of the day, all that mattered was Lily. And if Shadow was the one who could reach her, then maybe Jake had to accept that he wasn't the hero in this story. The day started like any other. But by the time the sun set, everything had fallen apart. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and for the first time in years, Jake decided to take Lily to the park. Not because he thought she'd play with other kids. Not because he expected her to talk. But because she had Shadow. Ever since that night, the night Shadow calmed her panic attack, Lily had started changing. She wasn't talking yet, but she was reacting more. Her eyes weren't as distant. She wasn't withdrawing as quickly. And most importantly, she let Shadow stay close. So today, Jake took a risk. He packed Lily's favorite snacks, grabbed Shadow's leash, and drove them to the small park just outside town. At first, it seemed like a good decision. Lily sat on a blanket under a tree, quietly watching Shadow chase a red ball Jake had brought. Parents chatted nearby. Children ran across the grass, and for a fleeting moment, things felt normal. Then the screaming started. "Help!" He bit her. Jake's blood turned to ice. He spun around, his military instincts kicking in. Across the playground, a small girl, maybe 5 or 6, was on the ground, crying hysterically. And standing a few feet away, Shadow was frozen in place, ears pinned back, eyes wide. Jake's stomach twisted. No, he wouldn't. A woman rushed forward, the little girl's mother. She scooped her daughter up, checking her arm. When she turned back to Jake, her face was pure rage. "Your dog attacked my daughter," she screamed. "He should be put down." Jake's heart pounded. "That's not possible," he said, stepping forward. Shadow wouldn't. She was just playing, and he bit her. The woman shrieked. Other parents started gathering, murmuring amongst themselves. Jake forced himself to stay calm, to assess the situation like he would on a battlefield. Shadow wasn't aggressive. He never attacked anyone. Then he looked at the little girl's arm. There was no blood, no puncture wounds, just a small red mark, a bruise, not a bite. Jake exhaled sharply. She must have tripped. I don't think, Jake started, but the woman cut him off. Are you calling my daughter a GLIA? She snapped. I saw him jump at her. I want him taken away now. More parents murmured. Someone whispered, that dog's been acting strange. Another voice chimed in. Maybe it is dangerous. Jake clenched his fists. This is getting out of control. And then, he heard the words that made his blood run cold. I'm calling animal control. Jake turned sharply. No, he had to fix this now. But before he could speak, a small movement caught his eye. Lily. She was standing. Standing. Not sitting. Not hiding. She was standing, her little hands clenched tightly at her sides, her tiny body trembling. Her eyes were locked onto Shadow. Her mouth moved. Jake stopped breathing. Was she going to say something? But before she could, the sound of a police siren cut through the air. A white animal control van pulled up next to the playground. And Jake knew. They were taking Shadow away. The officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. Sir, we received a report that your dog attacked a child. Jake's pulse roared in his ears. That's a lie. The mother shoved her way forward. Look at my daughter's arm. The officer examined the girl's bruise and nodded. It's not a bite, he admitted. Jake felt a surge of relief until the officer spoke again. But we still have to take the dog in for evaluation. What? Jake stiffened. You're not taking my dog. The officer sighed. Sir, we just need to observe him for a few days. Standard procedure. Jake's fists clenched. He knew what this meant. If they took Shadow, there was a chance he'd never come back. He turned to Lily. She was staring at Shadow. Silent. Frozen. Jake knew if they took him away, she'd shut down again. And then, Lily did something she had never done before. She ran to Shadow. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Lily never ran. She never moved toward anyone. But now she was gripping Shadow's fur, burying her face into him, shaking violently. Jake swallowed hard. You see that? He said hoarsely. That's my daughter. She doesn't talk. She doesn't cry. She doesn't let anyone near her. The officer hesitated. Jake took a step forward. You take that dog away. You take the only thing keeping my daughter from disappearing completely. The crowd fell silent. For a moment, Jake thought maybe they'd listen. But then the officer sighed. I'm sorry, sir. And just like that, they took Shadow away. That night, the house was too quiet. Lily sat on the floor, staring at the spot where Shadow used to sleep. Her tiny hands were balled into fists. Her lip trembled. Jake crouched beside her. I'm going to get him back, he whispered. I promise. No reaction. No response. Lily's walls were coming back up. Jake felt his chest tighten. He had fought wars. He had seen hell. But nothing compared to the pain of seeing his daughter slipping away from him again. He closed his eyes. Then he stood. Because there was only one thing left to do. Get Shadow back. The silence was unbearable. Jake sat on the couch, staring at the empty space near the fireplace where Shadow used to sleep. The house felt wrong without him. For the past few weeks, Shadow's presence had filled the air with something Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing: warmth. Now, all that remained was the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old wooden floors, and the distant sound of the wind pressing against the windows. But the worst part? Lily had gone completely still again. Jake glanced toward the corner of the room. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, staring blankly at the wall. Her hands, which once moved over blocks and toys, were limp in her lap. Her shoulders, which once flinched at sudden noises, were completely motionless. It was as if she had shut everything off. Jake swallowed hard. He had seen this before. It was the same look she had after Sarah died. The same emptiness. The same disappearance. She had let Shadow in. And now that he was gone, she was gone too. Jake tried everything. He made her favorite breakfast pancakes with extra syrup. She didn't touch them. He put on her favorite movie Finding Nemo. She didn't look at the screen. He even played her favorite lullaby before bed, the same one Sarah used to sing. Nothing. No reaction. No movement. Nothing but the quiet hum of a house that no longer felt like home. And then, 3 days after Shadow was taken away, Jake lost it. It was late. Too late. Jake hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table, gripping the half-empty beer bottle, staring at the walls as if they held the answers he desperately needed. Then, movement. Lily walked into the kitchen. Jake almost felt relieved, until he realized what she was doing. She went straight to Shadow's old corner and sat down. Jake's breath caught in his throat. "Lily," his voice was hoarse. "Come here, sweetheart." She didn't move. He stood up, running a hand through his hair. No. No, this can't be happening again. He crouched down next to her. "Lily," he tried again, his voice softer. "Talk to me, kiddo." Silence. The same suffocating silence that had haunted him for years. Jake's fists clenched. "Damn it. Damn it all." His voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm your dad." Not Shadow. May. Still nothing. And that's when something inside him snapped. With a sudden burst of frustration, Jake stood up so fast that the chair behind him nearly toppled over. "I am your father, Lily," he roared. The words echoed through the kitchen, bouncing off the empty walls. Lily flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but Jake saw it. And suddenly, the rage drained out of him, replaced by something worse. Guilt. He had scared her. His own daughter. Jake exhaled sharply, stumbling back, gripping the counter to steady himself. "What the hell am I doing?" His chest felt too tight. His hands shook. I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." But Lily had already curled into herself, burying her face in her arms, shutting him out completely. Just like before. And in that moment, Jake realized he had failed. Again. That night, Jake sat alone in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He had spent the past few years fighting for Lily. But now she was slipping away again. And this time, it was his fault. Jake took a shaky breath, reaching for his phone. Then, with a sense of desperation he hadn't felt since the battlefield, he dialed a number he never thought he'd call. Animal control. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then a voice answered. "This is Willow Creek Animal Services." "How can I help you?" Jake swallowed hard. "I need to get my dog back." The waiting room at Willow Creek Animal Services smelled like antiseptic and wet fur. Jake sat in a stiff plastic chair, his knee bouncing impatiently. His fists were clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. It had been 4 days since they took Shadow. 4 days of silence from Lily. 4 days of a house that felt more like a coffin than a home. And he wasn't going to let it continue. A door swung open. A woman in a pressed uniform, Officer Reynolds, the animal control officer from the park, stepped inside, clipboard in hand. She looked at Jake, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Mr. Carter." Jake stood immediately. "Where is he?" Officer Reynolds sighed. Shadow has been in observation since the incident. Jake's jaw clenched. He didn't attack anyone. Reynolds hesitated. There's no evidence he bit the child, but what? Jake snapped. Reynolds exhaled, flipping through her papers. Mr. Carter, there's something you need to know about Shadow. Jake's stomach twisted. What do you mean? She hesitated. Then she slid a file across the desk. Jake frowned, snatching it up. His eyes scanned the documents, confusion morphing into shock. Shadow wasn't just any rescue dog. He had been a military service dog. And he had a classified past. Jake stared at the documents, his mind racing. Shadow, originally named K-9257, had been part of a military working dog unit. He had been trained for combat, tracking, and PTSD therapy for soldiers. But something had happened. His previous handler had died in action. And after that, Shadow was retired. Discarded. Left in the system, bouncing from one failed adoption to another, until he wound up in Willow Creek's rescue shelter. Jake swallowed hard. No wonder he never barked. No wonder he moved like a trained soldier. He wasn't just a dog. He was one of them. Jake's hands trembled as he set the file down. So what does this mean? Reynolds hesitated. Because of his past, there's concern. Jake's heart pounded. Concern? She met his gaze. The city is considering transferring him to a specialized facility. Somewhere for high-risk dogs. Jake felt his chest tighten. No, he's not dangerous. I know, Reynolds admitted. But most people don't see it that way. Jake's fists clenched. You can't take him away. Reynolds sighed. The decision hasn't been finalized yet, but if you want him back, you need to prove he's not a threat. Jake's pulse roared in his ears. Prove it? How the hell was he supposed to do that? And then an idea struck him. Jake exhaled, forcing his thoughts into focus. There was one way. One shot. He turned back to Reynolds. What if I can prove he's a therapy dog? She blinked. What? Jake's mind raced. Shadow had already proven he could help people. He had helped Lily. He had helped Jake. And if he could show the city that Shadow was more than just an ex-military dog, maybe, just maybe he could bring him home. Reynolds hesitated, then sighed. It's a long shot, Carter. But if you can get proof, a licensed evaluation that shows he's a therapy animal, maybe we can fight this. Jake's jaw tightened. Then I'll do it. Because he had no other choice. Jake stormed out of the shelter, his heart racing. Time was running out. If he didn't act fast, Shadow would be gone for good. He needed to find someone who could evaluate Shadow. Someone who understood what he really was. And there was only one person who could help. An old friend. A former military K-9 handler. Jake pulled out his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then, a gruff voice answered. Carter? Jake swallowed hard. I need your help. The rain came down in heavy sheets as Jake drove down the old dirt road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Time was running out. Shadow's evaluation hearing was in 2 days. If Jake couldn't prove that he was a therapy dog, the city would permanently transfer him to a high-risk facility. And if that happened, Lily would never see him again. Jake clenched his jaw. Not gonna happen. The truck skidded slightly as he pulled up in front of a small, isolated cabin in the woods. The porch light was off. The place looked deserted. But Jake knew better. He slammed the door shut, marching up the steps. He knocked hard. No answer. He knocked again. This time, the door creaked open, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair, piercing blue eyes, and a permanent scowl. Jake exhaled. Hey Logan, Logan Daniels' former Marine canine handler. A man who had spent 15 years training, handling, and deploying military service dogs in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. And the only man Jake knew who could help him now. Logan didn't move. He just studied Jake with a hard, calculating stare. Jake didn't waste time. "I need your help." Logan leaned against the doorframe. "That so?" Jake ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "It's about a dog." At that, Logan's brow lifted slightly. Jake continued. "His name's Shadow. He was a military working dog. He lost his handler. Got dumped in the system. I adopted him for my daughter." Logan didn't blink. "And?" Jake's fists clenched. "And now they're trying to take him away." Silence. Then, Logan crossed his arms. "Not my problem." Jake's temper flared. "Damn it, Logan. You owe me." That got a reaction. Logan's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked in his cheek. Jake pressed on. "Afghanistan. 2011. You got hit. I dragged your ass out of there." "You said." "I know what I said." Logan cut him off. Jake stepped forward. "Then prove it." A long silence stretched between them. Then, without a word, Logan stepped aside, opening the door. The moment Jake explained the situation, Logan sighed, shaking his head. "They won't make this easy. They'll want proof. Official documentation." Jake exhaled. "Which means we need to test him. Show them what he can do." Logan eyed him. "You sure he's got it in him?" Jake met his gaze without hesitation. "I've seen it. He's already helped Lily. He's more than just a dog." Logan considered this, then nodded. "Fine. We train him. But it has to be fast." Jake nodded. "We have 2 days." Logan snorted. "Then we better get started." The next morning, Jake and Logan arrived at the shelter. Officer Reynolds met them outside, looking wary. "You actually found someone willing to certify him?" she asked. Jake motioned to Logan. "This is Logan Daniels, former Marine canine handler." Reynolds looked unimpressed. "That's great, but the board still needs to see proof." Logan smirked. "Then let's give him a show." Logan put Shadow through a series of evaluations, pushing him to prove his instincts, obedience, and ability to sense emotional distress. First, he tested obedience commands. "Sit." Shadow sat immediately. "Stay." Shadow didn't move an inch. "Come." Shadow trotted toward Logan without hesitation. Reynolds took notes, but her face remained unreadable. Next was the distraction test. They released another dog into the fenced area, a high-energy Labrador puppy that barked excitedly. Most untrained dogs would get distracted. Shadow didn't. He didn't chase. He didn't react. He stayed laser-focused on Jake. Finally, the therapy test. Jake took a deep breath and turned to Reynolds. "I need to bring Lily in." Reynolds hesitated. "You sure?" Jake nodded. "This only works if they see it for themselves." An hour later, Jake walked into the evaluation room, holding Lily's hand. She had been silent the entire ride over. But when she saw Shadow, her entire body changed. Her fingers twitched. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath evened out. Jake knelt beside her. "Go ahead, kiddo." Lily stared at Shadow for a long moment. Then, without looking at anyone else, she took a step forward. Shadow didn't move. Another step. Then another. And then Lily reached out, resting her small hand against Shadow's fur. Reynolds watched closely. "Is this?" Jake nodded, his throat tight. "She doesn't do this with anyone else." Then the impossible happened. Lily's lips parted. And for the first time in 3 years, she spoke. One word. A whisper. Shadow. The room fell completely silent. Lily's whisper echoed in Jake's ears, filling every inch of the sterile evaluation room. Shadow. Jake's breath caught in his throat. For 3 years, he had been waiting. 3 years of silence. 3 years of wondering if he would ever hear her voice again. And now, because of this dog, because of Shadow, she had spoken. Jake's hands trembled as he squeezed his daughter's shoulders. Say it again, sweetheart. Lily didn't look at him. She only looked at Shadow. And then, just a little louder, she whispered, Shadow. Reynolds was the first to break the silence. She cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably. Well, that's something. Logan smirked, crossing his arms. More than something. That's your proof right there. Jake turned to the board members sitting at the long table. You've seen it for yourselves. This dog isn't dangerous. He's not aggressive. He's the only thing that's helped my daughter in 3 years. One of the board members, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, sighed. Mr. Carter, this is certainly compelling. But this is an emotional response. We need to consider the safety of the community. Jake's blood boiled. Safety? Look at my daughter. She was disappearing before this dog came into our lives. He's the only thing keeping her here. You take him away, and you'll lose her too. Reynolds hesitated, exchanging a glance with the board. Even if we acknowledge his value as a therapy dog, the original complaint from the park still stands. Jake's fists clenched. You have no proof that he attacked that girl. That may be true, another board member admitted. But the public perception is already set. Jake's jaw tightened. So that's it? You're going to take away my daughter's only lifeline because some scared parents don't understand him? A younger board member, a woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. There's another option. Jake stiffened. What option? She folded her hands. We'll consider returning Shadow, but only if he undergoes mandatory retraining at a specialized facility. Jake's stomach dropped. He knew what that meant. Weeks, maybe months away from home, and no guarantee that he'd ever come back. He glanced down at Lily, who was still pressed against Shadow, her tiny fingers gripping his fur as if she knew what was being said. Jake exhaled sharply. No, that's not an option. The woman's gaze hardened. Then I'm afraid our decision stands. Silence. Then Jake made a choice. A reckless, desperate, military-trained choice. Jake took a deep breath. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times. Then he turned the phone around and pressed play. A video started playing. Security footage from the park. It showed everything. The little girl running, her foot catching on the edge of the curb, her falling before Shadow even moved. Gasps rippled through the room. The woman who had spoken earlier stiffened. Where did you get that? Jake's eyes were stone cold. A friend. The friend was Logan, who had spent the entire night hacking into the park's security system to get the footage. Jake leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. This is the truth. Your entire argument is based on a lie. Now you tell me why my daughter should suffer for it. The board exchanged uneasy glances. Jake could smell their hesitation. And that's when he pressed harder. You let this happen, he said, voice low, controlled, dangerous. You take Shadow away, I take this footage straight to the media. Every news station, every social media outlet. And I make damn sure that everyone in this city knows exactly what you did. The board members paled. Reynolds sighed, rubbing her temple. Jesus Christ, Carter. Jake didn't blink. Try me. Silence. Then, finally, the head of the board cleared his throat. The request to transfer Shadow is denied. Jake's heart nearly stopped. The man exhaled. Shadow will be released back into your custody. Effective immediately. For the first time in weeks, Jake allowed himself to breathe. An hour later, Jake knelt beside Lily as the shelter staff led Shadow into the lobby. The moment Lily saw him, she let go of Jake's hand and ran. Straight to Shadow. The black shepherd pressed his face into her shoulder, his tail wagging for the first time in days. Jake swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. Logan clapped him on the back. Told you he was a damn good dog. Jake let out a shaky laugh. Yeah, he really is. Lily pulled away from Shadow just enough to look up at her father. Then softly, hesitantly she spoke. Home? Jake's throat tightened. He crouched down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Yeah, baby girl. He rested a hand on Shadow's head. Let's go home. The house felt different. Not because the furniture had changed. Not because the walls were any brighter. But because, for the first time in years, it felt alive again. Shadow trotted through the living room, his tail wagging as he circled Lily like a silent guardian. Lily, his girl. She was sitting on the floor, carefully stacking her blocks, her small fingers moving with quiet focus. But every few minutes, she would pause and reach out, resting a hand on Shadow's back. Just for a second. Just enough to know he was there. And Shadow? He never moved away. Jake stood in the doorway, watching them, his throat tight. This was what he had been fighting for. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Jake sat on the porch, staring up at the Texas sky. Logan leaned against the railing beside him, sipping a beer. So, you did it. Jake exhaled. Yeah. Logan smirked. Didn't think you had it in you. Jake chuckled. Neither did I. A pause. Then, Logan nodded toward the house. She's different now. Jake followed his gaze. Through the window, he could see Lily curled up in bed, Shadow lying beside her like a silent protector. Jake swallowed hard. Yeah, she is. Logan took another sip. You ever think maybe she wasn't the only one who needed saving? Jake went still. The words hit deeper than he wanted to admit. Because the truth was, he had needed Shadow too. Not just Lily, him. The broken soldier. The lost father. The man who had forgotten how to fight for something real. Shadow hadn't just saved Lily. He had saved them both. A week later, Jake sat across from Miss Brown at Lily's school. She smiled. Lily's progress has been incredible. She's more present, more engaged. She even interacts with other children, just a little, but it's a start. Jake exhaled, relief washing over him. That's good to hear. Miss Brown hesitated. There's something else. Jake raised a brow. What? She smiled. She started drawing. Jake blinked. Drawing? Miss Brown nodded and pulled out a small piece of paper. She slid it across the desk. Jake's breath caught. It was a childish, uneven drawing. A little girl. A big, strong dog beside her. And standing just behind them, a man. Jake felt his chest tighten. He swallowed. That's me, Miss Brown nodded. She sees you, Mr. Carter. Jake looked down at the picture, his vision blurring. For the first time in years, he believed it. That evening, Jake was making dinner when he heard the sound of small footsteps behind him. He turned. Lily stood there, watching him. She hesitated, just for a second, then walked forward, holding up her drawing. Jake knelt down, heart pounding. You made this? Lily nodded. Jake swallowed hard. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Then, softly, hesitantly, she lifted her arms. Jake froze. She was asking for a hug. For the first time in 3 years. Jake's hands shook as he reached out, pulling her close, feeling her tiny arms wrap around his neck. He closed his eyes, his throat tight with emotion. Then, barely above a whisper, he heard her say, "Love you, Daddy." And just like that, Jake Carter finally let go of the past. Because this was home. And he wasn't going to lose it again.